Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Atlan is the metadata hub for your data ecosystem. Instead of locking your metadata into a new silo, unleash its transformative potential with Atlan's active metadata capabilities. Push information about data freshness and quality to your business intelligence, automatically scale up and down your warehouse based on usage patterns, and let the bots answer those questions in Slack so that the humans can focus on delivering real value. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Atlan today, that's ATLAN, to learn more about how Atlan's active metadata platform is helping pioneering data teams like Postman, Plaid, WeWork, and Unilever achieve extraordinary things with metadata. When you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends at Linode. With their new managed database service, you can launch a production-ready MySQL, Postgres, or MongoDB cluster in minutes, with automated backups, 40 gigabit connections from your application hosts, and high-throughput SSDs. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today and get a $100 credit to launch a database, create a Kubernetes cluster, or take advantage of all of their other services. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today we're flipping the script and I'm being interviewed by Scott Hirleman about my work on the podcast and my experience building a data platform. So Scott, before I hand the reins over to you, can you just share a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, so thanks, Tobias, for setting this up. I have a kind of crazy background, so let's not get into all of the things I've done. But right now, I'm helping a lot of folks in the data mesh community understand kind of what is data mesh, how to get going on that. I have a podcast around that. I've helped create a community that's being moved into a foundation around data mesh. I'm also going to be creating something, a working group around data contracts, so I don't have to focus on data contracts. So just I've got my hands in a lot of different pies. So
that's opportune timing because I actually just released an episode with Abe Gong about his opinion on data contracts from his work as the CEO and one of the co-creators of Great Expectations. So opportune timing there. And in terms of your experience of working in data, do you remember how you first got involved in that space?
It was kind of how I get involved in a lot of things, which is randomly. So I was hired on by a company to do semiconductor venture capital in about 2010. And then they realized about 3 months in that they didn't really want to go that capital intensive of venture capital. So they said, find a new space. And this was right when kind of, early 2011 was the kind of big explosion around Hadoop. And so looked at, tens or maybe even 100 plus of the kind of quote unquote big data startups and helped in the VC firm invest in data stacks and moved over there and have just been kind of bouncing in and around data ever since.
And so now, since you're actually here to interview me, I will hand the reins over to you and I will let you carry forward.
Awesome. Well, and I think before we jump in, we're going to be talking about a lot of things around, like you said, building your data platform. And how do you think about, you've talked with so many different companies and vendors and all these people. You've done a ton of the research for a number of people in your audience. But now that you're applying it to your own work, I'm going to be really excited to dig into that. But before we do get to that, I'm sure most people know at least some of your background, but would you mind giving people a bit of an introduction to yourself, and then we can jump into the conversation at hand?
Sure. So I have been working in tech for, I think, going on 12 years now. I actually started off, I got my degree in computer engineering. I liked that particular area of study because it was a nice hybrid between electrical engineering and computer science. So you get everything from how the transistors are built from the electrical components perspective up through the kind of computer science algorithms and data structures piece. I think that really set the tone for my career of kind of spanning everything from the silicon to the user interface. I actually started in tech as a systems administrator, so working on managing Linux hardware. My first day on the job, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I kind of had the tenacity to stick with it and figure it out. And so that's what carried me to where I am now. I actually got involved in data just largely because of working on systems and having to maintain databases and maintain infrastructure. Spent a while as a software engineer, so carried some of my operations experience into that role and kind of building systems in a way that carrying the operations focus into my software work, and then kind of naturally fell into the role of a DevOps engineer because that was around the time that it was picking up steam. So ostensibly, I've been a DevOps engineer for a number of years, but one of my jobs was actually as the kind of DevOps engineer and the sole backend engineer for a product that had a lot to do with clickstream data. And I came in with a project that was half implemented and we had to get it over the finish line. And that project was actually capturing all of the user events from a platform that was a JavaScript layer on top of video players. So we were dealing with all of the kind of video events and user interactions on different quizzes and overlays that our platform put up. And they were piping all of that into BigQuery. And this was around the 2015 timeframe. So anybody who worked with BigQuery in that time can understand some of the challenges that I was dealing with, because BigQuery is not meant to be an event store. It is great for processing lots of data, but it is not an event store. It is not intended that way. So, and I had a Python app, Flask app that would buffer data into a Redis queue so that it could flush it up to BigQuery. And then on the other side, we had to try and build a UI on top of that data that was end user facing. And so I was doing kind of embedded user facing analytics powered by a BigQuery database. So I ended up having to actually pre-aggregate data into a Postgres database and then do some more kind of views on top of that to be able to try and get this to work. So that was, I think, what really got me down the road of data engineering, just dealing with all of that pain of like, this is not how this is supposed to work. Like, let's pick the right tools for the right job. And so then in 2017, I had already been running my other show, podcast.init, for a couple of years. And I just decided, well, let's try another podcast. And so when I started my Python show, that was motivated by my engagement with the Python community. I was really digging deep into the language and its ecosystem. And I really wanted there to be a podcast about Python. And at the time, all the other shows that focused on Python had stopped producing new episodes. And eventually I said, okay, fine, I guess it has to be me. So I started that show, ran it for a couple of years, and then beginning of 2017, I said, okay, well, let's start another show. What's interesting? And I said, that was right around the time that Max Boschman wrote his posts about, the rise and fall of the data engineer. And I had been working with data, and it was, a very back-end oriented area of work, which is where I had spent a lot of my focus. And so it's kind of the interesting Venn diagram of operations and back-end engineering and systems. And so I said, okay, well, there aren't any podcasts about data engineering. And at the time, there were dozens of podcasts about data science because that was the new hotness. Data science was going to save us all. And it was what everybody wanted to do, but nobody was talking about all of the work that has to be done before you can do the data science. And so that was kind of the impetus for the data engineering podcast. And so I've been running that for 5 years. And it was kind of perfect timing because it was right at the inflection point of when everybody realized, oh, wait, actually data engineering is a thing and we really need to invest in that. And so I have had no shortage of material to discuss on the show.
Yeah, I think that especially that part about the computer engineering, like I was like, wait, is that different from computer science and electrical engineering? And what you said, I think really ties in really well to where I think a lot of people overlook a lot of the key parts of data engineering is that it is kind of all of the systems up and down. And so much of it is spent on just the processing versus like, how does this all interconnect? And, I'm sure you're familiar with the OSI model and like, how do we not have that OSI model for data of actually working together on that? So I would love to hear about, you've been talking about this on the podcast for a while about building out your data platform. I would love to hear, let's start with kind of one question that some data engineers don't typically like, but why are you doing this? Like, what's the point of this? Versus let's get to the cool speeds and feeds. But like, what were you actually trying to accomplish when it came to building this out? Like, what was the reason for doing this now? What was the impetus? And what's the actual goal of doing this?
Yeah. And so to give a bit of context there, as you said, I've talked about this on the show a bit, but for people who are just tuning in the first time right now, my day job is not actually being a podcast host. This is a kind of a hobby / side gig, despite the fact that I am now at 3 podcasts and producing most of them weekly. So for my day job, I actually work for MIT as the Associate Director of Platform and DevOps for Open Learning, which is a department within the Institute. And our focus is on building products that are mostly externally facing. So bringing the knowledge and educational understanding and pedagogy that MIT develops and making it available to anybody in the world who wants to engage with it and learn and, potentially even come to MIT to extend their education. So we have, honestly, I don't even remember how many business units at this point because it feels like they always add a new one. But some of the more famous ones are OpenCourseWare, which was one of the first kind of free online learning resources that was put on the internet. So that's, I think, over 20 years old now. So that's course material from MIT professors that is released as Creative Commons licensed information for anybody to use however they want. So that's lecture notes, it's lecture videos, quizzes, all kinds of different resources out there. We've got MITx, which is the MIT MOOCs that are produced. So it's actually largely course material that is used for MIT students and then slightly remixed and put on the Open edX platform for people to be able to take those courses on their own time. If they want, they can get a certificate of completion for it. We have another product called X Pro, which is similar, where it's using the Open edX platform to produce course material for professional education. So that's people who are mid-career, they want to stay up to date with different technologies or techniques or trends. So there are courses on things like systems engineering, quantum computing, data science. And so we have all these different products. As a member of the engineering team, we build systems that support all of these efforts. So we build scalable systems and we design them in a way that they can be adapted to different purposes as they are needed for the department. One of the first forays into making data insights available to the department was actually just standing up a Redash server as a quick and dirty business intelligence platform. So for people who aren't familiar, Redash is a BI platform focused on data visualization. It's written in Python and Flask, so it's got a good ecosystem of plugins to be able to connect to various different data sources. And so you can just stand it up and say, okay, I'll just connect directly to my application databases, munge the data to be able to get some reports to people so that they can get their job done. And we've been using that for a number of years now. And it's always been a bit clunky, some sharp edges, a little painful, because it's not designed to be the entire data platform. We made it work, so we kept kicking that can down the road a bit. And so the goal of our work on revisiting this idea of build a data platform that is scalable, just like all the other systems that we build, that is maintainable and adaptable. And so we want to be able to actually incorporate the information that we generate from all these applications and systems that we maintain and all of the services that we engage with. Another thing that was lacking in the kind of Redash implementation was any sort of cohesive data governance, any sort of cohesive view of what data do we even have and who is generating what data, because mostly it was tied into the systems that we on the engineering team built and maintained. But there are other groups in the department who don't necessarily rely on the engineering team to build their platforms for them. So there are other sources of data that are kind of the shadow IT approach. Not in the sense that they're not approved, but just in the sense that not everybody in the department knows that they exist. And so it's hard to be able to actually get a concrete view of what information we have available as a department to be able to further the goals of open learning, of making education available to everyone in the world. And so that was, in terms of the timing, we've been building more systems, we've introduced new product offerings, and so we had kind of hit the tipping point of where Redash just wasn't really cutting it anymore. The appetite for data in the department has been growing, and so there have been kind of pain points and friction that we wanted to be able to address by building a holistic data platform that we can use as a solid foundation to build forward for now and into the future.
One thing that I keep seeing that gets overlooked when people are building these platforms is the user experience. Are you first starting, on the data mesh side, when people say the self-serve platform, I say, for whom? And it's like, okay, I had somebody on the podcast recently and they listed out like 12 different personas that they're building their, different user experiences for. Are you first starting with getting people to be able to publish easily or being able to get people to consume easily? Like, because I think if you're trying to get focus on the consume, it can be putting the cart before the horse. And like, how do you think about that roadmap? Like, how did you plan out when, what, why? And then, how do you start to build that out so that you're not like, okay, I'm going to debut this thing in 4 quarters and it will be the greatest thing ever. And people haven't gotten to touch it and give you feedback and give you the chance to iterate on it.
That was definitely a bit of a stumbling block early in the process where the overarching goal was we want to just start with what is the foundational piece that we can build that will allow us to even start that iterative process of figuring out who are the first users, how are they going to engage with it. So initially it was just let's figure out how do we get all the data into one place so that we can work with it. What are the ways that we're going to work with it as an engineering team that fit with our overall development model? So we were definitely very focused on kind of code oriented software engineering principles first. And we wanted to build a system that was flexible so that we could plug in different interfaces for different stakeholders and use cases. So the kind of flexibility and adaptability was a key design consideration in how we selected the various components and the way that we wanted to build it out. We aren't jumping straight to, hey, let's build a self-service platform so that everybody will do everything that they want. It's how do we build a system that lets us say, okay, we can build an initial data set that is useful for this persona, get that in front of them, let them start working with it, and then we can build from there. And we also didn't want to do a point solution of, hey, we're building for this person, so let's engineer it with that in mind, because then we're going to take a bunch of shortcuts that make it harder to re-engineer down the line. So we had to say, okay, what are the sampling of some of the use cases that we want to be able to build for? And let's do a very kind of bottom-up first principles approach of let's start with, let's get the data in one place. Let's be able to interact with the data. Let's be able to, transform and model the data so that we can get it into a shape that is actually useful for other people. Because we had that Redash platform in place, that also gave us a little bit of directionality of, okay, well, what are the ways that we are already using the data? What are the questions that people are asking? And so that can help us understand, what are the priorities of which data sources to pull in first, which transformations to build in. So that helped with the overall kind of design process. As we're talking right now, we haven't actually put it into quote unquote production where we don't have people hammering on the platform yet. We're still building that out to, okay, let's get this to a point where we are happy saying this is production grade and we will support what we have built so far when people start using it. And right now we're in the phase of kind of crossing our T's and dotting our I's, and we're getting to where we can say, okay, here's the first use case, here's the data for you to be able to use. Go ahead and start working with it and let us know how we can improve. Once we hit that point, then we're really going to be in our stride of iterating and saying, okay, this works, this doesn't work. This is the piece that we were missing that we didn't know we needed, or, yes, we knew we needed that. We just didn't do it yet because it wasn't core to the kind of foundational capabilities of the platform.
One thing that I've talked about a little bit is the concept of what I'm calling a data Shrek, just because it's the stupidest name I could think of. And I just love doing that stuff. But like a purposeful swamp where you purposely create a data swamp. So you've got kind of a sandbox and people can't immediately start using data from it. But like, it sounds like what you're saying is your team, the data team, are the ones that are deciding what is useful and what isn't. I've seen this from a couple of companies where the art of the possible, that the data consumers don't really think about the art of the possible, about, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, or do we have this data? Are you finding that you're almost having to generate consumer demand for data as well? Because, the MIT system is quite different in the academic space versus, a lot of corporations where they're like, I am trying to do this to drive my business unit to more profit. Like, you're driving to more for good or something like that. So like, how do you think about that aspect as well? Are you finding that that's made things a little bit different? Like, because you are doing a lot of the work without the consumers necessarily directly involved.
We have been working with some of the people in the department, not promising anything or saying, hey, this is what we're building, but say, just understanding from the ways that they're already doing their work, what are the things that they're trying to do with information? What are the questions that they're asking and how are they getting their answers? And okay, so they are managed to get answers. Are they good answers? Are they timely answers? How can we make their experience better? And then kind of building towards that so that when we do flip the switch to say, okay, this is production, this is ready for you to use, we can go to them and say, hey, that thing that's really hard and annoying for you to have to deal with? Here you go. It's easier now.
As part of this, you're talking to so many of these people, so much of the speeds and feeds, but I think you also have a good focus on the high level of what are we trying to do and why. Like, how do you get yourself from focusing on the cool tools and focusing more on what matters and what matters to this use case. And like you said, you're building this foundation to build something scalable on top. But, you're like, well, I need it to be able to handle, 10 million requests a second. And it's like, are you ever going to get 10 million? It's like a fun engineering challenge versus the like what actually matters. How are you keeping yourself in that mode?
One is just kind of working with other people beyond just myself. So I'm not doing this in isolation, kind of tinkering at long hours into the night. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can I direct my team? How can I work with my manager and some of the people on the development team to be able to build this and make sure that everybody understands what we're building? So that helps with the kind of shiny tool syndrome where I don't want to just bring in everything under the sun because I know that I'm going to have to make sure that everybody understands how it all works together. So it was, what are the core pieces that we absolutely have to have in place to be able to do something? And then also one of the decision criteria that I've been leaning on is if this tool or vendor goes away tomorrow, does that completely destroy everything else about the platform? So designing around these kind of composable elements. I don't want to throw out the term modern data stack because I wouldn't say that's quite what we're doing, but some of those principles of, build with the inputs and outputs in mind, build so that each kind of unit of functionality is something that if I have to, I can either engineer a replacement or there are other options out there. I also tend to bias heavily towards open source because everything that we build is open source and we rely a lot on open source. We contribute to open source. And also from a kind of platform maintenance perspective, it's important to be able to understand what's working. If something is broken, I want to be able to have the power to dig in and fix it without having to rely on a support ticket that has a turnaround time of 3 weeks. Very much being able to own our own destiny around this platform is important as well. And so the overall architecture that we built up is kind of the data lakehouse paradigm with ELT, just kind of throwing out the buzzwords there. But concretely, we ended up using Airbyte as our data ingestion tool because there's been a lot of community investment around that. It has support for pretty much all of the data sources and destinations that we needed. Because it's open source, we have the ability to be able to create our own plugins for those cases where there isn't something that we can pull off the shelf, but we don't have to re-engineer the entire kind of infrastructure around the data movement piece. We just say, this is the API that we need to hit. We already use AWS for all of our infrastructure, so it was kind of a no-brainer to use S3 as the storage layer. Everything speaks to S3, so that makes it easy. And then we're using Trino as the query engine, again, because there's a lot of community support around that. Concretely, we actually used the Galaxy offering from Starburst so that we didn't have to do all of the operations around spinning up Trino clusters on our own. It's kind of a serverless-ish way of interacting with it where I can just say, okay, just give me a cluster, let me query. I don't have to worry about all the operational aspects of it. But in the event that either they decide to kill that offering or it doesn't do what I need it to do, or I need more customizability, I do have that option of just saying, okay, well, I'm just going to throw open source Trino in, run it up myself, and no harm done. I don't have to re-engineer anything around it. It's just Trino at the end of the day. And then we're using Dagster as the orchestration engine. That's actually one of the first decisions that I made, just because I really believe in the programming model and the philosophies that they have around data orchestration, being very kind of data aware in terms of how the units of computation are built, and just the fact that it is a very well-designed framework that has enough extension and integration points to be able to customize to fit whatever needs we have without being overly prescriptive and constraining. So for the kind of metadata layer, for being able to actually schematize the data in S3, we're just using AWS Glue because it's there, it's easy, well, relatively easy to use, but it does a good enough job. And honestly, that's actually one of the hardest pieces that we dealt with in the process of trying to get this up off the ground is actually managing that connection from, okay, I can pull my data out, I can put it in S3 to, okay, now I can actually query it with Trino. That seems to be one of the kind of missing pieces in the ecosystem in general of being able to actually put something in S3 and then be able to query it without having to do a bunch of work in between. So AWS Glue has their crawlers, for instance. which works great if you just have a little bit of data. But as soon as you start scaling the kind of number of tables and the variety of data that you're working with, then it starts to become very painful to work with and orchestrate. And if you just try to throw it at a bucket and you have lots of different data sets within a bucket, then it'll say, hey, they're all the same table, which obviously does not work. And so we found one plugin for Airbyte that used the AWS Lakehouse interface for managing those table schemas, and that worked a bit, but there were some sharp edges where we didn't actually want to use the lake formation. We just wanted to use glue, but that was the most expedient way to do it. And then we ended up actually working with somebody in the Airbyte community to add a layer on top of their existing S3 destination that would talk directly to Glue and introspect the schemas that Airbyte was pulling through and just write that out as a table definition in Glue so that we could very seamlessly say, okay, pull it through Airbyte, it's in S3 and I can query it right away. I don't have to worry about, oh, my schema changed in the source and now I have to wait for the crawler to run before I can query this new column. So just figuring out how do we get the experience of writing into a database without the constraints of buying into a BigQuery or a Snowflake or a Redshift and be able to have that adaptability and flexibility that the Lakehouse ecosystem promises.
And I've got two potential avenues to go down based on a lot of what you were talking about there. One would be from microservices, the concept of that anti-corruption layer. Like we shouldn't have to have that in data. We should have an OSI networking model where we have to have anti-corruption layer between the tools instead of, between the services. But also a lot of what you're talking about the data team, the central team is the consumers. And you just mentioned the schema change and you were talking about data contracts and things like that. Like, have you found anything where you can push that up to the source to say, hey, you're trying to make this change and it's going to break things? Or are you still in that reactive mode? Because this was something you had Abe Gong on. I had Abe Gong on a while back. And he said something that just horrified me that I didn't know about, which was consumers would create expectations and basically contracts without ever telling the producer that these are our expectations in our contracts, that there was never that communication. So either of those two things I think would be really interesting to kind of go down.
Yeah. So kind of managing the interaction with those source destinations. Right now, we're still in the phase of let's just get something working. And it's not even a matter of like the schema change. Like that's something that I'm guarding against. It's really even just a matter of I'm adding a new data source. I want to make sure that the schema is there. That's the hardest part. Like even that basic capability is what was missing in being able to use, just S3 and Trino. So from what I've been able to understand running the podcast and doing my own research, this idea of the Lakehouse is gaining a lot of steam, but it's mostly from people who are using something like Spark, where it has the built-in support with Iceberg and Hoodie, et cetera, to be able to just create those table definitions directly. And if you're not using that, then you're kind of left out in the cold of, well, I guess you should just use Snowflake because that's the thing that's going to work for you. And so there didn't really seem to be a lot of appetite for people to say, okay, well, I actually want to do a Lakehouse. I don't want to have to buy into Spark because I don't need that right now. I just want these two things to be able to communicate the right way. And so that's where we actually said, okay, well, let's just try and make this happen, at least in a way that we can use it, and then we can try and help build on top of it there. Across the community, like being able to use something like Trino as a Lakehouse engine was kind of the missing piece. There was that disconnect between get the data to a place where you can query it and then be able to actually understand what you're querying.
A lot of what you were talking about as well of the vendor selection and tooling and open source and things like that. You've obviously got a pretty well-honed BS detector, even from selecting guests and then from having interviewed, you're on, I think, episode 300 plus or whatever of this podcast and of, you're probably nearing 1,000 total episodes across all your podcasts. When you think about that kind of build versus buy, a lot of the tools that you selected were open source, but a lot weren't. They were custom to AWS. So you're kind of locked in potentially to AWS, which I think people overestimate the cost of locking into a cloud vendor and things like that. But unless, Google starts doing what GCP starts doing, what they've done with other Google products where they just kill all the things off and it breaks everything. But how do you think about build versus buy? And then when you think about even buy, you talked about with Trino, how do you think about that, like open source versus not, and how do you think about kind of protecting yourself versus I just want to get to getting the work done, right? I just want this thing, I pay X amount and it's just going to work and I don't have to care. So I'm going to hit the easy button. Brandon Bidell on your podcast had talked about this a lot. And, I asked him to come on mine simply because I really love the conversation you had with him about this stuff as well.
Yeah. So the build versus buy, I think one of the main things I consider when I'm saying, okay, well, I'm just going to go to a vendor with this is, what is the escape hatch? If this vendor goes under, if they get acquired, if their product just stops working one day, how do I keep moving past that point? For instance, with Galaxy, as I said, I can pay for it right now. I don't have to worry about all the operations aspects. But if I get to a point where, it's too expensive to run it through them and I just want to do it myself, or some other reason I need more customization, whatever, then I can just take Trino off the shelf and run with it. AWS Glue, it's a managed service, but effectively it's just a Hive Metastore at the end of the day for the ways that I'm using it. So if I have to, I can just run Hive Metastore myself. I don't want to. I want there to be something better than the Hive Metastore, but it's what we've got for now. And so for Dagster, I'm actually running it myself because I already run a lot of applications on EC2. So I've got the capabilities to just deploy it and manage that iteration. But if I get to the point where I say, hey, actually building and deploying this is a giant pain, I don't want to have to deal with it anymore, well, then I have the option of going to Dagster Cloud. I don't have to rewrite all of my code. It just continues to do the thing. Same thing with Airbyte, where I'm running the open source version myself on my own infrastructure. But if I get to a point of, hey, this is too much time and headache, I don't want to deal with it anymore, I can just say, hey, Airbyte Cloud, take my workload. Everything else stays the same. It's the what are the escape hatches in both directions, where if I build it myself and then I decide, hey, it doesn't make sense for me to run this, how much time and effort is it going to me to then say, okay, well, I want somebody else to do it for me. And then if I say, hey, I'm just going to buy a vendor because it makes my life easier, I can get something up and running faster. If I then decide that I don't like what the vendor is doing or I need some control that they're not exposing, then I can say, okay, I'll run it myself, because at that point, it will be worth the expense in terms of time and cost.
One thing that you didn't wrap in there that I'm assuming you look at somewhat, but it sounds like it's not quite as big on you, is the roadmap for if a vendor is going to, open source, it's a lot harder to say, like, what is the roadmap on the open source and things like that, or at least I think for most projects. But when you're tying into a vendor, how much are you betting on that vendor versus you're saying, I need this capability, they have the capability now, versus I've got this gap now and I'm okay taking the pain of doing this manually or of just not fulfilling this gap, but they're saying they're going to meet this in the future. And how much does that factor into your current day decision?
It doesn't have a lot of play, especially because I'm building around these open source tools. So particularly for vendors that are built on top of open source, if there is something that they are not doing that I decide I need to have happen, then I have the power to actually just contribute that capability to them. That's another factor of the kind of control aspect of this thing does 90% of what I needed to do. I would really like it if it did this other thing, but I have the knowledge and the capability to be able to make it do that thing if I want it to. And that's where some of the tool and vendor selection comes in, as well as, how much potential input do I and my team have on making the world the way I want it to be.
That's funny because anytime I talk to somebody who has a sysadmin background, that is exactly their approach. It seems to be that, you've been looking through a ton of these things. Like, if you don't mind, if you take us through some kind of capability selection where you said, I needed this, what was the thing that I actually did? You've talked about doing Pulsar instead of Kafka. I don't know if you're at that point right now, but any of these things where you said, okay, take us back in your mind, walk us through how this might have happened so other people can get a sense of what was your thought process, and then they can either mirror that or they can augment it for their own process. But I'd love to hear kind of, where do you start when you start to look at this? Was it, I need this capability, what are the tools that are available? And then, okay, I'm going to go out and make that selection. Or was it like, I have good feelings about this tool. I want to see where it fits in and if I can slot it in because I like the way that they talk about it, the way they approach things. And so I want to make sure that we can, put that in a modular way, but build it in. Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's definitely from the capabilities perspective of, for instance, the data integration piece of I just need a way to be able to get my information from point A to point B, from my Postgres database into my Lakehouse. Or if I decide, hey, the Lakehouse isn't working, I'm just going to say forget it and go with Snowflake. Do I have that option? And so I looked a bit at, some of the commercial offerings. I didn't bias towards them. I was trying to bias towards open source because of the kind of customizability perspective. And so I looked at Meltano was one of the ones that I was digging into, and Airbyte as well. Spent a lot of time comparing them against each other. I even spent a little bit of time saying, well, what about if I just say, let's just go with Fivetran because I can just throw a credit card at it. I don't have to do all this work of operationalizing. And so those were probably the kind of top 3 contenders. I looked a little bit at some of the other commercial vendors, but it really came down to what are the data sources and destinations that I'm considering working with? How well do these different tools function with those connections? And at the end of the day, Airbyte is the one that had the majority of what I needed to be able to get my job done today versus having to spend the next 6 months engineering a solution to it. And so in particular, the connection to the data lake layer was what was the most challenging, where I was looking for that piece of, okay, I can get it into S3. Is it in the right format? Does it support writing to S3 as Parquet, or is it only as JSON? If I write it out, can I get a table definition around it? Or is it just, hey, here's a bunch of data somewhere. Now you have to do 3 more steps to actually make it useful. Or, when I was looking at Meltano, they've built a great product there, but some of the pieces I was looking for specifically, like at that S3 layer was, okay, well, you can write it out as a Parquet file, but only to local disk, or you can write it out as a JSON file to S3, but then that's all it does. It doesn't talk to the schema layer. And so I actually tried to dig into the code of Meltano and some of those plugins to say, okay, well, if I really want it to do what I want, how much work is that? And then at the end of the day, I said, okay, well, Airbyte does what I needed to do. It's easier for other people beyond me to be able to use it because they have a very nice UI for managing connections. And that was actually another demerit on their part was when I first started looking at it, they were very UI first of if you want to create a connection, you have to do it through the web interface. You don't have a code first way of doing it, which went against the grain of what I'm trying to build of I want everything to be code first, automated, it goes into GitHub and that's the source of truth, which is where Meltano has their strengths of, we are a data ops tool. Everything you do is through code. There kind of is a UI, but not really. But then they don't have an API to be able to actually manage the orchestration piece of it as easily. So you end up having to embed it as a command line execution in the Dagster workflow. So it's like, It was that kind of capabilities matrix of what are the things I care about most? What are the things that I can do to make this work the way I want it to versus things that I have to wait on other people to maybe implement? So Airbyte ended up winning out in that regard because of the list of connectors that they had available, the growth and support of the community around it. And actually, as I was working through some of the initial implementations is when they started their work on their command line utility. And so I've actually been working with that team to say, okay, it's great that you have the command line. Working with it is a bit of a pain. What if you just made it a Python package so that I can do whatever I want with it? One of the ways that I'm kind of unfairly privileged as the host of the data engineering podcast is because I do have kind of implicit access to the people who are building all of these tools and companies to say, hey, yeah, you remember that time you were on my podcast? Well, now I want you to do this for me because that would be great.
I just had a conversation with Ananth, who's doing Schemata. I know he was on, and we were talking about how important it is to be part of somebody's workflows and how, the multiple panes of glass, everybody wants to be the main pane of glass. And so multiple panes of glass is a major pain in the ... You can finish that. But how are you thinking about that user experience for yourselves right now? Because you are the main user. You are the conduit between we're absorbing this and we're pushing that. Is that you're building out that so it is just code workflows and that it makes it so that it's just easier because then you don't have 15 different places where you're trying to manage it and you're trying to do all of that. And that's kind of your anti-corruption layer almost of hey, we have it in code, so we know where it is. We don't have all of these hidden dependencies that we don't know about.
Yeah, definitely very focused on code first, code being the source of truth. I'm building around the orchestration layer being the beating heart of the entire platform where everything has to get routed through the orchestrator or else it doesn't happen. And in terms of the end user consumption piece, our intent isn't to dictate this is the only way that you can interact with this information. We're building it in a way that we're going to build the data sets for you to do what you want with. Here are the ways that you can connect to it. So if you want to just hook your Tableau into a data mart that has all of your information in it, go nuts. If you want me to put it into Redash or Superset, here you go. If you want to build a machine learning model off of this transformed data, here's the way that you go ahead and do that. And so building it with, the orchestration layer is the source of truth of how everything gets to where it wants to be. It is the piece that, makes sure that everything does what it's supposed to do. And then saying, okay, this is the boundary that we are maintaining complete control over. And if you want to do other things for, beyond that point, here are the interfaces that we are willing to expose for you to get your work done. And then here are maybe some useful guardrails to make sure that you don't end up in a ditch somewhere.
When you think about the orchestration layer, if that's such a core piece, that can be a single point of failure, right? When you think about scalability, you think about modular approach, you think about that. Like, how are you trying to make sure that that doesn't become your pain point? And maybe if you can wrap in the concept of when you're thinking about these tools, the total cost of ownership, right? It's not just the initial purchase price. It's not just the control, but, you talked about with Airbyte where you're like, I don't want to go into the UI. This doesn't do exactly what I want it to. This is very frustrating. And so you think about the total cost of ownership of like, how much pain do I have of using this? How much is it going to be to my day-to-day? And how much training do I have of people to use it and things like that? How do you kind of think about that?
Yeah. So the orchestration layer, it is the authoritative way of getting things done, but it is not the only way of getting things done. So for instance, I'm working towards embedding the Airbyte connection definitions into Dagster so that it is all in code. It manages kind of creating those connections and maintaining them and keeping the credentials up to date. It manages executing those syncs and then making sure that the DBT run executes immediately afterwards, making sure that all my tables are up to date. But if I need an escape hatch, I can go into the UI and say, just run this thing right now. And I can go to my command line and say, run this DBT code right now. And I don't have to necessarily go through the orchestrator. But I understand that that's kind of the paved path approach. I had a good conversation on this show with somebody where they were talking about their kind of paved path approach of like, if you want to do something, this is the easy way to do it. We can get you from point A to point B as long as you follow our rules. If you want to do it yourself, great, go for it. Not my problem.
Yeah, I think I remember somebody talking about Roman road, the exact phrasing that they used on it.
Yes.
So, when you're doing these evaluations, it sounds like I was expecting us to talk more about vendor BS detector stuff and like thinking about that. But a lot of it just seems to be that you already know that you know more than any rep that you're going to be talking to about the tool and things like that. But if somebody else is looking at building out their platform, you've talked to so many people, like, what advice would you have for others when they're building out their platform? Is it, start from X or look at Y or, like, if someone were to say, Tobias, please write me the pamphlet around how do I build a good and scalable and useful platform? Like, do you have a place to start and kind of your do's and your don'ts or your anti-patterns or things you've learned where you go, and I thought I would do this and it didn't go so well?
Yeah, well, my snarky answer of where to start is episode 1. But realistically, it's really a matter of understanding what it is that you're trying to do and why you're trying to choose a particular tool, not just, hey, that tool looks really cool. Let's figure out how I can make it work. Taking it from the perspective of what is the end goal rather than how do I find a reason to use that tool. It's not resume-driven development. And so figuring out what am I trying to do? Okay, now how do I understand what are the things that will do that thing for me? And the thing that's always interesting when you're looking at vendors and products is, for instance, data integration. It might be a feature of a broader offering. And so because it's just a feature, they're not investing their whole engineering effort into making that useful and robust. So is that good enough where you actually don't care about the data integration so much as the other thing that they do? Or is data integration the thing you care about the most? In which case, go for Fivetran or Airbyte or Meltano. And then also, what are your capabilities as an engineer, as an organization? What are your priorities? Like, do you care most about being able to move fast and not having to spend all of your engineering time on minutia? Or, do you care about having that control capability of being able to solve your own problems? So if you just want to be able to move fast and have something that works, sure, go for Snowflake, go for BigQuery. They're great products. But if your goal is to be able to, be very flexible and adaptable and have an escape hatch of, hey, if I decide that I'm paying way too much to Snowflake, do I have a way to get out of it? Or is all of my data there and now I have to pay to get it all back out?
Your one question that you always ask people is like, was there anything surprising that you really didn't, expect going into this? And like, especially you're talking about building this platform kind of all at once. It's not, you are going to add on to it and expand and all that, but it's not okay, we're adding a new capability because we need this new capability. You're kind of congealing it all at once. And that can lead also to tool sprawl because you're like, I want to have best of breed for all of these things. So like anything surprising, or how do you think about kind of the tool sprawl aspect?
Are you struggling with broken pipelines, stale dashboards, missing data? If this resonates with you, you're not alone. Data engineers struggling with unreliable data need look no further than Monte Carlo, the leading end-to-end data observability platform. Trusted by the teams at Fox, JetBlue, and PagerDuty, Monte Carlo solves the costly problem of broken data pipelines. Monte Carlo monitors and alerts for data issues across your data warehouses, data lakes, dbt models, Airflow jobs, and business intelligence tools, reducing time to detection and resolution from weeks to just minutes. Monte Carlo also gives you a holistic picture of data health with automatic end-to-end lineage from ingestion to the BI layer directly out of the box. Start trusting your data with Monte Carlo today. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Monte Carlo to learn more.
One of the things that I thought at the outset of this project is, okay, one of the first things I have to do is get the metadata layer in place. Nothing proceeds without metadata. And that's one of the things that I've had to bend a bit on of, okay, well, we're able to get some stuff done. Yes, it will be great to get a metadata layer in, but, Dagster has enough metadata to be able to answer some of the questions about kind of lineage and execution. The thing that I found most surprising was really that gap in the kind of connective tissue between data integration and kind of data access and data manipulation in that Lakehouse architecture paradigm, where I thought it was actually going to be easier to be able to say, I just want to dump this into S3 and then query it in Trino. But there was just that one link in the chain that nobody bothered to forge. I was a little surprised at how challenging that ended up being. I helped make it better, which is, again, why I chose open source. Seems like other people are investing in that area as well. And so you don't necessarily have to be bought into Spark or Flink or what have you. You don't have to be fully bought into the vendor ecosystem of, AWS Lakehouse or Lake Formation or, the Google product suite. I forget all the names that they have out there for it. But that was the other piece. Like, okay, yes, you can build a Lakehouse as long as you're all in on AWS. Everything has to be AWS, which means you need 15 different services. So that was another aspect of tool sprawl that I didn't want to get into. It's like, yes, it's all AWS, but now I have to figure out what are all the APIs. Like, I actually only need this one service for one API call, and the rest of the other 50 things that it does, I don't care about. So that's another aspect of it is like, is this functionality the core capability of what I'm buying it for? Or is it just incidental that I have to use this thing because somebody else says that I have to use it because that's what they integrated with?
And well, in that metadata problem, I've been talking about the trapped metadata problem of all of these systems generate all of this metadata. And so like, where is a primary place for X metadata? And do people have to go to these 15 different places to understand what you're actually looking at, what it means? And then, thinking about observability. And I just talked to somebody yesterday who said one thing that they implemented observability and it seemed like it was going to be great, except for now they were just, there's no prioritization. So do we have to start to bring in the kind of SRE reliability engineering concepts more to how we're doing data so that somebody who can actually know, okay, this is important and this isn't, right? This thing looks a little bit weird. Well, we pull that report on a weekly basis. So it looking a little weird today and it's Tuesday and we're not going to pull it until Friday. Yeah, we want to keep an eye on that, or it's not crucial. It's just something one person uses and it's kind of helpful, but it's not the biggest thing versus this other thing. And how do you actually do that prioritization? How does it all cohesively work together instead of I'm going tool to tool to tool to tool? It's just like you're almost playing telephone, and you get purple monkey dishwasher very, very quickly because every single tool is like, I integrate with this tool in this specific way, but it doesn't take into account how it integrated with the tool that was further up the chain. And are you just finding that would that I could, right? That it's like, wouldn't it be nice if somebody had actually done this in a holistic way, but you just kind of have to do the best with what you've got? I mean, were you expecting that, or was that something that kind of hit you?
Yeah, I knew going into it from having talked to people on the podcast for so many years that the metadata situation is a mess. There is no kind of perfect solution, despite what everyone might want to tell you. And that's actually one of the spaces that I'm seeing the most evolution right now. There are a lot of product categories where the thing that it does is always going to be the thing that it does because it does it well. So data integration is always about getting data from point A to point B. They might put a shiny interface on it, or they might have different levels of connectors, or it might be batch versus CDC, but it's still just move it from here to there. Metadata, I think, is where the biggest opportunity is right now of how do we make this, as an industry, a cohesive and unifying experience versus the kind of schismatic fragmentation that we have where I have my metadata engine, it collects my metadata that I care about so I can use it for observability. I have my metadata over here, it does governance. I have my metadata, it tells me when this execution ran. I have my lineage data over here. I have my catalog over here. Starting with the kind of data catalog space is where I think the broader conversation around metadata started to gain volume and traction. And if you look at the data catalog companies that started 3, 4, 5 years ago, they're not even talking about data catalog anymore because that has become, it's a feature, not a product. And so, now it's about, active metadata. It's like, well, still not quite a product. That's a feature of the metadata layer. And so, data lineage, again, there are products that started off as data lineage. It's like, well, okay, that's great that it has lineage, but how do I find the thing that I care about to know where it came from? So that's data catalog. I think that all of these products that started off as a feature of the metadata fabric are starting to expand. Recently, I had a conversation where I described it as ripples in a pond. They all started as a drop in the pond of metadata in their own little corner, and now those ripples are spreading out and converging. And so we're getting to the point where, we are building up to this point where metadata is ubiquitous, it is all-encompassing, it is of critical importance, and everything needs to know about all of the metadata everywhere without it being a siloed experience of, okay, well, I have this metadata about this tool over here, and now I either have to build a linkage to this other tool to map it into their metadata format. But the fact that there are people who are thinking about how do we make this interoperable so that it is a team sport instead of a gladiatorial arena.
To me, every tool should be broadcasting out there should be standard APIs that everybody broadcasts out, and that it marks metadata as kind of alpha or beta, primarily generated from this tool versus not, and that it integrates into your workflow. So if you do have somebody who's, at the CLI who's got, whatever, that they can see it there and they can say, okay, this is the all-encompassing metadata around this. But if somebody's in the data catalog or kind of the data marketplace, which is becoming that kind of UI for kind of, increasing data literacy and all of, but nobody is willing to do it because it is a moat that they have built. And so, the couple of companies like an Atlin or an Open Metadata or things like that are being more open about it. I don't know. I hope they get paid off for doing the right things, but I don't know. So before we jump into the thing that I wanted to kind of wrap up around the kind of doing the call to action around guests, is there anything that we didn't cover that you think, like any advice or anything that we didn't cover that you think we should have relative to kind of building out this platform and what others can learn from what you've done thus far?
I think that one of the perennial problems in technology is the bias towards speed and action without necessarily understanding the destination. So, sometimes that's useful when you don't actually know what you're doing and you want to do some initial discovery. but it's all too easy to just take that discovery into just the end goal and building the final product without actually really knowing why you built it or for whom or for what. And so there are so many kind of shortcuts and bad architecture and design decisions that I've seen, both in terms of my own work and in talking to people in the community and the different products and this also brings in the conversation around data modeling of you need to take the time to figure out like, what are you trying to do? How are you going to do it? And how are you going to get there? Rather than just, I want to get over there, so I'm just going to start running vaguely in that direction and hope I don't hit a wall. And that's not to say that we all need to go back to waterfall, and this can be an organizational issue too, where if you have people in management who say, no, we just really need to get over there, let's just do it. You need to have that kind of pushback, bottom up and top down buy-in of being purposeful about the way that you're doing the work and the destination that you're trying to arrive at, so that you don't get to that point of, hey, I ran straight over there and now I'm standing in a data swamp and I have no way out because my boat sank.
And that you have that communication with people, like data consumers, that they don't lock on to, hey, we're iterating, we're figuring this out, we're trying to get to this thing, like we're trying to work with you. But like that limiting of technical debt is because exactly what you talked about. I keep talking to people who say, no, the only thing that matters is speed. And it's like, fast, cheap, or well done. You get to pick one. And if you pick fast, it's not going to be well done. And in the end, it's not going to be cheap and it's going to cost you. But, I think we need to figure out as an industry, how can we capture some of the value quickly, but not lock ourselves in to that expensive option, because we went and we said, we're going to capture 50% of the value up front with an understanding that it's going to require rework and iteration. But I'm just not seeing ways of doing that. It's like this pie in the sky of, wouldn't it be nice? But nobody ever actually tells you how to do it.
Yeah. The other piece of it too is, particularly if you're starting from zero and you say, I have all of these grand plans and ambitions, but you need to start somewhere, is, okay, well, what is the core piece that you can start with that does some percentage of what you're trying to do, that has the capability to expand and evolve and build on top of? Like, what is your foundation? Because if you try to build your system on shaky foundation, it's all going to fall down. But if you have a solid foundation that doesn't do everything you want, but it does half of what you're trying to do, and it has the capability of doing more, that's the thing to try and build on top. That's one of the reasons I really like this Lakehouse paradigm of, it gives you a way to say, hey, it's SQL first. Everybody understands SQL. I can use dbt. I can use all of these tools that understand SQL. But then I can also still, run a Spark pipeline, or I can still write a bunch of Python and pandas and be able to do other things with the data where I'm not constrained by SQL, or I don't have to pull it all out of Snowflake before I can then go do the thing, or I have to use, Snowpark and whatever capabilities they decide to offer me and pay however much extra for it.
Yeah. And this is kind of where I was frustrated by a lot of the modern data stack talk, was everything that people are building is built on a shaky foundation, not necessarily the stack itself, but that all of the upstream can continually change and break all of these data products that aren't actual products, because we're not thinking about like life cycle of a product. We're thinking about trying to encapsulate something that we hand to somebody, but it just keeps breaking. And so, yes, we can get too fast and we can get to some value, but it just breaks. And so can you never rely on that for actual business ongoing things or not? It's just a frustration of mine that I've seen over and over in these conversations.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about how we've been iterating is being able to have some sort of a buffer layer where even if that upstream source completely changes or just completely breaks, that doesn't mean that that is immediately reflected in the end user experience. So, the idea of, the ELT of let's just land everything in raw. Nobody ever touches raw for anything. So if that just completely breaks today, fine, I'm going to have a lot of work to do, but it's not going to be cataclysmic. And then saying, okay, now from raw, I'm going to clean it up a bit and then put it into a staging area. So the DBT model of, land it in raw, stage it so that you can clean it up and get some sort of cohesion around the semantics of the data that you're working with, then put it into your intermediate, which is where people might start interacting with it, and then put it into your mark for, business users who just want to be able to see at their dashboard, are my KPIs correct? So that if your source system completely crashes and you can't pull raw data anymore, you can still see the report. It's just a little bit stale. Or I pull everything in and now my DBT model broke because there's an extra column or there's a column missing. Okay, well, I can see that it broke because there's an error message and I can just go and fix that and then everything else works. So just having those kind of safety valves in the process of going from, I don't control the upstream. If something breaks there, I can figure out a way around it to, this is the controlled experience that I'm giving to everybody else. And I'm not beholden to all of these other systems to be completely, constantly up to make sure that I can still serve my customers.
Yeah, I had Chris Ricamini on mine, and he was talking about developers, software engineers can't really care about certain things because they can't know what changes are going to break. So I did want to get to one thing that I'm passionate about, which is as well about a lot of people who reach out to you, just like me, are probably going to be the vendors, right? That's why you've got a lot of vendors on the podcast. And you're also obviously very interested in talking to a lot of the vendors. But, when you think about what is your ideal guest, do you have that? Or do you have something where we can have a call to action for more people that are actually building the things? And no, you're not going to have all the answers. But what do you want to tell to potential guests? Listeners out there who aren't thinking right now that they could be a great guest, but that you would love to talk to.
Absolutely. So my litmus test for understanding, should I have an episode on this topic or with this person, is kind of myself. I use myself as the listener of, is this something that I find interesting that I want to learn about? Will this be helpful to the work that I'm trying to get done? So whether that's talking to a vendor to say, okay, what are you building? Why do I care? How do I make it work? And how does it fit with the rest of what I'm trying to do? Or talking to somebody like you or me, or, just kind of in the trenches engineers or managers of, hey, what are you building? Why are you building it? What are the challenges? How did you get around it? What's your process for tool selection and build versus buy? Is there some really gnarly bug that you found in Spark's shuffle files that kept you up at night for 3 weeks until you finally got it fixed? How did you go through that process of debugging? What are the things that you're afraid of? You built your data platform and it works, but that there's a skeleton in the closet and it's just waiting to jump out at you. Like, how do you keep it in the closet? What is it? And definitely want to encourage anybody who, works with data practitioners to reach out. When I started the podcast, I definitely had a bit of imposter syndrome because I was a systems engineer, not a data engineer. And, talking to people about, distributed big data systems with, or, particularly now where I'm starting the machine learning podcast, where I do not have a fancy stats background, or, I've done some advanced math, but I don't have a PhD in neural networks or what have you. Definitely have some imposter syndrome around that. I had it when I started the data engineering podcast, and yet now, 5 years later, somehow I'm seen as one of the foremost experts in the space. Like, how did that happen? I'm just a guy with a podcast. So, definitely don't want people to be intimidated just because I've been doing this for so long. I'm just a guy who is curious and likes to talk about interesting stuff.
And I think, I suffer with the same thing of people are like, oh, Scott, you're the expert. And I'm like, I'm not doing this work. I'm going and extracting this information from people. Like, that's what I do with the podcast because I'm interested and I think it will be interesting for the audience. But I'm not an expert, especially data mesh stuff. We're so early. Mac and I have talked about this. Nobody can be an expert right now because we're figuring it out. If somebody was in 2010 and saying, I have microservices all figured out, you just laugh them out of the room, especially in hindsight, right? Even with data engineering, you are an expert. But, anytime I suggest it to somebody, a lot of people go, that sounds really intimidating. And it's like, Tobias is really nice. He's going to take care of you. He's going to ask, good questions. And the worst thing that can happen if they reach out to you is that you say, that's not really an episode I'm that interested in doing right now. I suggested a few people and you were like, that's not actually the thing that I'm that interested in right now. And it's like, okay, right? Like, oh no, that's the end of the world. Do you have any advice? I just don't have vendors on my show just because right now in data mesh, they just want to vendor wash. They just want to sell. And I don't go super deep into the technology aspects like you do. But do you have any advice for vendors? Like, one thing that I've always kind of said is vendors create a platform for your users and they'll positively mention you and that they can talk about really interesting things. Like, do you have advice for vendors reaching out, and then maybe we can go into advice for the non-vendors, the practitioners reaching out.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is do your homework, make sure I haven't already talked about exactly what you're trying to talk about, at least in recent memory. The other piece is I'm always happy to have vendors on the show because they're the people building the things that we're all using, but I'm not going to bring you on the show just to kind of repeat your branding or your marketing material. I'm actually going to dig in and figure out what is it that you're building and how and why, so that people who are trying to do that evaluation are a step ahead of the game so that when they do get onto their sales calls, they can say, well, on the podcast, you said that this is how it's supposed to work. How does it actually work? And how are you going to make it work for me? Versus, oh, well, I'm going to bring you on the podcast and I'm just going to happily spout whatever your marketing material says about, you can spout puppies and rainbows and unicorns into my data lake and everything will be magical. Like, what are the pain points? What are the things you can't do? When are you the wrong choice? I definitely enjoy being able to have people on so that we can dig into all the cool and fun things that you're doing, but I'm also going to ask about the things that you can't do and expect that you're going to be honest about it.
Yeah, I'm always skeptical when somebody says, I don't know, there's not that many things we can't do. And I'm like, well, you just lost your credibility. You spent an hour building it up and you just lost it in that one little second. But do you like it when vendors bring you their users? And it's not like we're going to have you talk about how you used XYZ tool, but it's like, hey, here's somebody who had this big challenge or they've got these set of 5 challenges. Is that something that you're kind of open to? Is that something that you find useful?
I've definitely had plenty of vendors who I've worked with, who I've had on the show, and then who have said, hey, I've got this customer who's doing something interesting. They happen to use us. Do you want to have them on the show? I've had lots of conversations like that. Generally, they go pretty well. So definitely interested in just kind of talking to people about the challenges that they have dealing with data. How do they address them? What are the things that they still can't do? What keeps them up at night? So just my general filter is I try to make a show that I find interesting, that I find educational and helps me figure out how to keep doing my job better.
Yeah, same. And one thing that I try to tell people is that think that you are good enough, right? And it's not, if it's like, hey, this isn't really a fit, it's not that you aren't good enough. It's just, I've talked about this, or this is something that's not really that interesting to me or the audience or something like that. But for me, I think that's one of those things of, at least I just see myself as just a guy that's asking stupid questions and that has done, 120 interviews. So my questions are going to sound more smart than, somebody who's just starting out because I've talked to so many people about this stuff and that you are good enough to be on this. And Kinneret, I'm talking to you specifically at this point. So I told you I would say that you should be on and I fully mean it. But do you have any kind of words of wisdom for people to be brave?
The way I always frame these interviews is that I think about it as a hallway track conversation that you'll have at a conference. So you just bump into somebody and you overhear them talking about, oh man, I was up late last night because my Spark cluster failed. And you're, hey, what happened with that Spark cluster? Why did it keep you up? Could you have done it in the morning? No, because I had to have the report out at 5 a.m. for my stakeholders. Oh, great. Well, why do you have your stakeholders looking at reports at 5 a.m.? So just that kind of curiosity and interest from, you just walk up to a complete stranger and then you start, talking through all of the, their successes and failures as somebody working in this space because we all have them. So we're all just people trying to do our best.
I think that's part of the reason why your podcast has been so successful is you don't ask people to prove themselves when they come on. You've already said, okay, I think you're an interesting person. I want to dig into that. So I do try and tell people you are good enough, be brave and kind of reach out. So I'm all good on my end. Is there any way that you'd kind of like to wrap up, or did you want to ask yourself your question of any tooling, or you've kind of talked about where you're seeing a lot of the metadata issues, but any way that you'd want to wrap up the episode?
I'll kind of close with the gap. The one that I've brought up before is I still think that there is a missing link in the kind of data production stage and making sure that there is a smooth transition into data platform and analytics, particularly in application frameworks where you think about, oh, I have my ORM, it helps me work with my database. I don't have to think about the mechanics of the database too much. I can just do what I want to do, write my business logic. How do we get to that point of where we can capture the context and semantics of the domain objects that we care about in the application and expose them without dehydrating them, send them over into the data lake? How do we maintain all of that richness and context and do it in a way that the application engineer doesn't have to spend an extra 6 months building some fancy new feature just to pipe it into the data platform and then have to change it again. Like, how do we make that something that is just, pip install a package or, drop these 5 lines of code into your data model and it just does what it's supposed to do?
Yeah. Zhamak and I have had that conversation about why do we decompose everything about the information? And so it's just the ones and zeros, and we're focused on processing the ones of zeros and then try and re-add back all the context instead of treat it all as if it's like a package of information at once. And so, yeah, I fully agree on that. So we talk a little bit about how people should reach out. Any other way that you'd I've got a little call to action that I recorded ahead so that I don't go on and on. The one thing I did forget is if you are interested in figuring out how to do data contracts, do get in touch with me because I am putting together a working group around that. So I don't want to ever have to hear about data contracts. I want this group to figure it out and kind of move forward relatively quick. But outside of that, is there any way you'd kind of want to wrap up the episode?
Yeah, so I'll say that for folks who appreciate your work on this show, I'll remind them that you do have your own podcast. Have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes for anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing and get in touch. And just thank you for taking the time today to join me and grill me on my experiences with building a data platform and running the podcast. It's always fun being on the other side of the mic and being the person who has to answer the questions. So appreciate you leading this conversation and taking the time to help the audience explore a bit about my side of things that don't always get out there.
Well, you've learned so much, right? You've done so much of this that it's super valuable for the audience out there. So again, thank you, Tobias, for having me on. And thank you for being such a great, quote unquote, guest on your own podcast.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other shows, Podcast.init, which covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used, and the Machine Learning Podcast, which helps you go from idea to production with machine learning. Visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.